I'm just waiting for confirmation from our producers. Hang tight.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Sandra, you can begin.
Thank you. Yes, hello, everybody. Welcome to the tutorial on fairness and the legality of fairness metrics under EU non-discrimination law. I'm Sandra Wachter. I'm a lawyer by background, and I work at the University of Oxford at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I focus on the legal and ethical implications of emerging technologies, especially machine learning and AI. And yes, I will be presenting my newest paper today, and I will try to share my screen now and then just tell you a little bit about how I would like to structure this session. But first things first, let's see if this actually works. So if everything just worked out, you should be able to see slides now. I don't see Gwen telling me otherwise, so just assume everything is fine. Fantastic. So thank you so much. So this is the latest paper that I would like to present today. It's called Bias Preservation in Machine Learning and the Legality of Fairness Metrics under EU non-discrimination law. So as I said, I'm a lawyer by background, and I teamed up with Brent Middlestead, who is an ethicist, and Chris Russell, who works in machine learning. Actually, both of them are here today on this call, and hopefully will join us for the Q&A afterwards to answer any questions that you might have. As far as I understand it, you cannot really use Zoom to pose any questions. You would need to use Slido for that. And Gwen has kindly offered to help us sift through those questions if you should have any. But yeah, that's from my perspective. I will be talking for roughly 30 minutes or so, leaving us with 15 minutes to talk about this stuff in more detail. Yes, so that's the paper. We just went live with it. So if you wanted to access it or look at it in more detail, then you can find it on SSRN. So I'm only going to be able to give you a rough overview over the things that we are discussing in that work. So the overview, roughly, and those are the themes that I would like to touch upon in this talk, is what fairness means in the law, questions around what fairness means in computer science, and then talk a little bit about why I think that law and computer science are currently clashing. What I would like to do is to start the talk by telling you about the findings that we had, and then use the rest of the time to tell you how we arrived at this point. So roughly what I think is that we're currently standing at a crossroad, very important crossroad, where we have to make an informed decision when it comes to AI bias and fairness questions. One thing we could do is do absolutely nothing and just let technology run its course and by doing that, see how existing inequalities are getting worse in our society. The second option is that what I think a lot of things are currently pointing towards that is not trying to make things worse, trying to fix the technology and ensuring that things don't get worse as they currently are. And the third option that we have is using machine learning and AI to shed light on existing inequalities and use this as a starting point to start fixing society and to actually improve the situation for the majority of the people. So those are the three options that I think are ahead of us. And now I'm going to tell you how we arrived at this conclusion. But first, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about bias and what we mean by bias. Inspired by Nissenbaum's classification, we think it's helpful to think about bias in two types of biases: technical bias and societal bias. So by technical bias, we mean that the problem that you're dealing with stems from the technology itself. So this could be biased data sets or design choices that you make. So an example would be, for example, machine facial recognition software. And we know that facial recognition software works worse for women and for people of color. Why? Because the technology has been trained on predominantly white faces. So you have a technical problem that then leads to an unfair outcome for certain groups in society. That's the idea of technical bias. Another way of thinking about bias is societal bias. So societal bias means that the trouble actually stems from the human making the decision, and their decision then flavor the data and the decisions that are being fed into the algorithm. So for example, if you have somebody that is making hiring decisions and is deciding that people with disabilities should not get any jobs, this data and this decision-making process feeds into the algorithm and then leads to the fact that people with disabilities are being rejected at a higher rate. Of course, this distinction between societal and technical bias is not absolutely clean. One informs the other, obviously. There's a reason, for example, where we have facial recognition software that is trained on predominantly white faces. It is just a result of societal inequality in itself. But I think this distinction is still very helpful because it shows you what people are teaming up to fight against. One camp is trying to fix the technology in itself, and the other one is trying to fix society, the underlying social problem. So let's have a look at how the law thinks about it. What is it that the law wants to fix? So I think it will come as no surprise that the law is about fixing society. But what does it actually mean? What does fairness actually mean under the law? And here again, it will come as no surprise that the law thinks that everybody is equal. And this goes back to Aristotle, who said that you should be treating like cases alike and unlike cases differently. Sounds very clear, but again, it leaves you wondering, what does equal treatment actually mean? And to talk about this in a bit more detail, I actually want to go back to a very personal story of myself that inspired me to study law in the first place. So I must have been roughly 6-7 years old, and we read a piece in class that was called The Wise Judge. So The Wise Judge centered around a story of two siblings, a brother and a sister, fighting over cake. And the judge was then tasked to make a decision who should get what share of the cake. And the way that the judge decided that case was to say the brother is the one that gets to cut up the cake, but the sister is the one that gets to choose first. And I remember that vividly when we read that story, and I thought, what an elegant, fantastic way to make sure that everybody gets an equal piece. If a discipline is able to come up with such a foolproof, clear way to establish equality, then I want to be part of that. And I think it really, really inspired me. And I think a lot of people will agree that this is a very neat way of making sure that everybody gets an equal share. But what if I told you that the sister hasn't eaten in 3 weeks? Would you still think that having an equal share is a fair outcome or not? And this discrepancy, this conundrum, is exactly what is reflected in the concepts of non-discrimination law in Europe. We have roughly two types of concepts. We have formal equality and substantive equality, or de facto equality. So formal equality means you treating everybody the same. You're not making any notes of who those people are. You just making sure that everybody gets the same size piece of cake. Or you have substantive equality, which is you not trying to close your eyes between the differences between the group. You actually take into consideration that somebody hasn't eaten in 3 weeks, and therefore you give them a bigger share. And then, of course, you have equality of results, which means that you actually are more on the more radical side of things, that you care about what the outcome actually is. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, there's a law that says there has to be a 50-50 splits between Catholics and Protestants in the police force because of the historical troubles that those two sides actually have. But roughly, you can think of it as formal equality, treating everybody the same, and substantive equality, de facto equality, taking into consideration how people have different experiences in society. So those two concepts are actually also legally recognized in European non-discrimination law. We have direct discrimination and prohibitions against indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination means you are being treated less favorably because of a protected attribute that you possess. So that means I'm not giving you a job because you're a woman, or because of your ethnicity, because of your sexual orientation. In most cases, this will be illegal. So as you can see, this goes very closely to formal equality and the Aristotelian postulate of treating everybody the same, closing your eyes for the differences of different people. I'm just making sure everybody gets equal treatment. And then you have indirect discrimination, which is more akin to substantive equality. So indirect discrimination means that a seemingly neutral provision, criterion, or practice is applied to everybody equally, but it just so happens that it poses a particular disadvantage on a protected group when compared with others in a similar situation. So that means if I'm hiring and I'm saying, oh, I'm only going to hire people that are taller than 2 meters, you would see that height is not a protected attribute. It seems neutral on the face, but you will understand that having a height requirement when hiring will at least disadvantage women in that process. So this is the really big difference between indirect and direct discrimination. Indirect discrimination really wants to acknowledge the social hurdles and struggles and actual factual differences between those groups. This concept, the indirect discrimination, substantive equality, was created to dismantle the underlying power structures. You can think of it as a diagnostic tool that helps you shed light on where inequality exists and tries to exemplify where more social engineering needs to happen. The basic underlying assumption is that everybody is equal, and if the outcome of a system making decisions is unequal, then there is something wrong with the system, not the people. And once this happens, once you have the idea that you think that something might be wrong with the system, so prima facie discrimination, so on the face discriminatory, like with the height requirement, what would happen is that the burden of proof then shifts to the alleged offender, so those who are making the decision, and they then need to justify themselves using a legitimate interest and that they're pursuing a proportionate and necessary means. I'm going to talk about that later, but that's the roughly distinction here. So what you can say is that even though the law has this distinction between formal and substantive equality, it's very clear from the literature as well as from the case law that the declared aim of substantive equality, the declared aim of non-discrimination law is substantive equality. That means just closing your eyes, giving everybody an equal share of piece of cake is not good enough. You ought to take an active role in dismantling inequality. For example, making sure that everybody has equal access to health or education. It's really about trying to redistribute resources from the disadvantaged, from the advantaged to the disadvantaged. It's about equal access to social goods for all people. It's not just about economic disadvantage. It's actually about actively trying to promote diversity, social inclusion, making sure people can participate in the community. It's about solidarity. So you can see the aim of the law is actually to change the power structures in society, not just closing your eyes for to the differences and treating everybody the same. So this is what the law wants when they think about fairness. So what does computer science want to fix when they talk about fairness? And again, it probably will come as no surprise that the tech community very often is interested in trying to fix the technology, which makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about how they are dealing with that. So very often, the fairness metrics that are being developed in order to detect discrimination are based on what's called conditional independence. So conditional independence means that you're trying to make sure that the target variable that you want to predict and the additional and conditional attributes are independent from a protected attribute, for example, sexual orientation. So if you're trying to figure out if somebody should get a loan, your target variable, you want to make sure that this target variable and an additional attribute, for example, salary, are independent from sexual orientation, ethnicity, and gender. So based on this idea of conditional independence, we came up with a classification structure that lets you divide all those fairness metrics up in either being bias preserving or bias transforming. So what do we mean by bias preserving? So bias preserving means that the metric has an explicit dependence on the target variable. So what does that mean? That means if I want to know if somebody should get a loan, that's my target variable, I'm also conditioning on the same variable, for example, past loan decisions. And I want to make sure that those are not depending on race, gender, sexual orientation. So basically what you're doing is you're asking the question if prior candidates who have applied for a loan and were successful in repaying it, do those people look similar to the person that is now applying for a loan? What you're trying to do is trying to match error rates across groups. What you're trying to do is check whether the false positives and the false negatives are equal across the groups. So in other words, what you're trying to do is you're trying to preserve the error rates, not making things worse than they used to be, not making more mistakes than you used to, therefore bias preserving. The other category that you could fall into, according to our classification, is bias transforming. This means that the target variable is that the variable that you condition on is not the target variable. It could be something very different. The key difference is that bias transforming metrics usually are satisfied when the decision rates are matched, whereas bias preserving fairness metrics are satisfied when the error rates are being matched. So let's go back to bias preserving. At first look, it looks actually quite fair, because what is it that you're doing? You look at past loan decisions and you see if somebody was able to repair a loan, or you look at university admissions and you see, oh, those people did very well in law school. Therefore, if this person is similar to a past candidate, well, we should admit them, because obviously we can have some assumption that they will also do well in the future. Or should we give insurance to this person? Somebody very similar did not actually get sick, so they would be a good candidate for getting insurance. And the same for jobs. So what you're doing is you're assuming that you have some ground truth. You're trying to use the past decisions that you made to justify the future. You're trying to use the status quo as a neutral starting point to make decisions. But the issue is that the status quo is not neutral at all. And I want to talk about one particular example. In the paper, we talk about much more. Unfortunately, because we're pressed for time, we cannot go into all of those at once. But let's talk about grades, for example. I think most of us will agree that that very often our grades can be very subjective. And obviously, bias can find its way into how we're grading people. But what about math grades, for example, like 2 and 2 is 4. There is some ground truth around this. You cannot really have much interpretation around this. But what you might not know is that, for example, in the US, the teachers often assess the mathematical skills of boys more favorable than girls, even though they have the same, sometimes even better abilities than the boys, and they give them worse grades. So girls get worse grades than boys, even though they're equal in ability. They're offered boys are being offered more mentorship. They are often more encouraged to go into STEM subjects. This type of gender bias then continues actually at university, where research shows that male peers rank female performance less than male performance, even though they're actually equal. And the same bias then is transported into the job market, where you can see interesting research that shows when you send out 2 batches of identical CVs, and the only difference between the one batch is that one has male-sounding names on them, the other one has female-sounding names on them. You will see that both male and female assessors rank female abilities as less qualified than male abilities. And if they're actually being invited to a job interview, they're being offered less salaries, and they're then very often overseen for promotions. The gender bias is also reflected in reference letters, where women are often being described as team players or hardworking, and males are being described as trailblazers or geniuses. And it's very hard to pinpoint the exact point in time where this actually starts. We just know it happens very early on in our lives, because there's research that shows that by the age of 6, children, if you show them a picture of boys doing cooking and sewing, they will misremember seeing a girl. So very early on in our lives, we have a very clear notion of what gender roles actually look like. But here's the trouble. AI doesn't know about this. AI doesn't know about the social story between the data points. And I would argue that probably most of us are not fully aware of those biases either. And now let's think about how often we use grades or reference letters or salaries as objective criteria to make decisions, but they're actually not unbiased. And now think about how often grades were used to award fellowships or jobs or entries to universities, how often reference letters were used for loan decisions or jobs, how often, we look at promotion history or high salary as a metrics of success and merits. It seems neutral, but it's not. The status quo is not neutral. And here is it exactly where I think that the law and computer science actually start clashing. So let's go back to those 2 fairness metrics that we have. Let's go back to the underlying assumption that comes from computer science. You have one fairness metrics, bias preserving, that is trying to match typically error rates. And that says, well, I am happy as long as things don't get worse than they used to be. I'm trying to match the error rates. Bias transforming metrics, on the other hand, say, I'm only happy if the outcome is equal across groups, because I'm trying to match decisions. So you have one metric that says, I'm happy with keeping the status quo, and the other one says, I'm only happy if equal access has actually occurred. With that in mind, let's go back to what European non-discrimination law actually wants you to do. So what we can say is that the bias preserving metrics, so those that match error rates, are more akin to formal equality, only focusing on equal treatment between groups without attempting to change the underlying system. Whereas bias transforming metrics, the ones that try to match decision rates, are more akin to substantive equality, the idea of changing things that underline an inequality in the world. So if we go back to the aim of European non-discrimination law, as I said, the aim is very clear. It's substantive equality. The role, what the law wants is for us to take an active role in eroding inequality, to dismantle disparity, and to achieve parity and inclusion in society. The law believes keeping things as they are and making sure that it doesn't get worse is just not good enough. What bias preserving metrics do, because they condition on the status quo, is that they start to freeze it, and that can be an actual problem. So what we argued in that paper is that if you are making decisions in a protected sector about people using bias-preserving metrics that, as we said, actually frees the status quo, we say that this can give rise to prima facie discrimination. That means that could be on the face discriminatory. And because of that, you need to justify it. And I will come to this a little bit later. Obviously, even if you use bias transforming metrics, it doesn't mean that you're out of the woods. If you use bias transforming metrics, you still need to justify disparity if it actually occurs. But the difference is that those type of bias transforming metrics do not assume that the status quo is neutral. And that's a very big difference. In addition to those differences, bias preserving metrics also clash with substantive equality for other reasons. So one of them is that in bias preservation, the reason as to why somebody didn't get the job, for example, don't play a role at all. So what does it mean? So like reasons for not hiring somebody because they're Black would be just as good as other reasons as to like they didn't have a PhD. You cannot actually see what the reasons were for the decision. So you actually don't have any ground truth whether it was the right decision to begin with. So conditioning on this is actually a problem. Second, you don't have actual information about the counterfactual universe. Again, you're pretending to have ground truth, but you don't. You only have information about the people that were actually invited to a job interview and those who got hired, went to university, but you don't have any information about those who were rejected. Obviously, you could use proxies for that. So for example, you could use a high credit score to estimate whether somebody will repair a loan, or you can predict if somebody will be arrested to predict if they will break the law. But there is a mismatch between the thing that you're predicting and the proxy that you're using. And by doing that, you're just inviting more bias into this because the proxies are just as biased as the other data as well. And lastly, by conditioning on the status quo as a neutral starting point, you're overestimating the role of meritocracy, and you ignore other things like inheritance and luck, unequal opportunity, and discrimination. So just a couple of stats here. In the US, for example, 40% of the children who are born in the lowest income group remain there for the rest of their life. It's 20 in Nordic countries, 30% in the UK. An interesting study, OECD study on social mobility from 2020 showed it takes six generations in Germany to move from the lowest income bracket to an average income bracket. It takes 5 generations in the United States and Austria, and at least 3 in Finland and in Sweden. So you can see social mobility is actually quite hampered here. So after this discussion of bias preservation, the question is how prevalent are bias preserving metrics in the CS literature? So what we did is we looked at 20 different fairness metrics that are currently out there and try to assess whether they would fall under bias preservation or bias transforming. 13 out of 20 are bias preserving fairness metrics. So roughly 2/3 of them use the status quo as a neutral starting point to make decisions. This does not mean that bias preserving metrics don't have a role in society and have a place. It's just it's very important that you understand the normative decision that you make when you choose one of those. Bias preserving metrics can be used without any problem for things like diagnostics or testing or research purposes. And actually, you should test as much as possible because you're going to be liable regardless if you knew about it or not. Intent is not a prerequisite for being charged with discrimination. Second, you can still use it for making decisions about people in situations where, for example, there is no normative consensus of what a good decision actually would look like. And just making sure that things are not getting worse might actually be good enough in this particular instance. You can also use bias preservation where the ground truth labels are actually known, or where there is no bias, or the bias is actually justified, or you're using it in a jurisdiction that only pursues formal equality. What we're arguing is that if you're using bias preserving metrics for decision making about individuals in a protected sector in the European Union, that this can give rise to prima facie discrimination, and you might need to justify this. Again, in short, what you're doing is, by choosing a fairness metrics, you're making an explicit decision on whether or not the status quo is acceptable or not. Okay, so after all of this and the long journey on how what the law actually wants, the law wants us to erode inequality. First question that will come up is, okay, who is supposed to be doing that? Who is the one that carries the burden of trying to make the world a better place? And that's the hardest point, because it's a bit of the hot potato that nobody wants to touch. It's very clear that the scholarship, as well as the case law, agrees that there is something like a duty to dismantle inequality, but who should be that person and what that duty actually looked like is still very much disputed and discussed. It's not really clear what the active or passive role of a regulator, a legislator, or the private or public sector are supposed to be. Some say you have a preemptive duty to dismantle inequality, for example, in your company. Others say, no, you only have to do that if you have a hunch that inequality actually exists. Others say, well, you only have to act if somebody complains, and that's all you need to do. You need to compensate that person. Others say, no, you need to restructure completely after a complaint has been lodged. Others say we should not have complaint-based system at all because it's very hard for individuals to actually win in litigation. So, to summarize this, there's agreement that there's a duty, but it's not clear what the duty actually should look like. However, if I convinced you that you ought to take an active part in trying to make the world more equal, the question is, okay, what kind of fairness metrics should I actually be choosing? And that leads us to the choice of fairness metrics, because there are 20 of them, so which one should you take? In this, we actually wrote a paper last year, again, Brent Middlestead and Chris Russell, which is called Why Fairness Cannot Be Automated, Bridging the Gap Between EU Non-Discrimination Law and AI. Paper is also up and publicly available, where we try to actually figure that out, trying to figure out what fairness or legal or illegal disparity in normative terms, and whether or not this idea actually has a component or an equivalent in computer science. And again, it's not perfect because the law is very continuous and evolving and often not coherent, but there is something that has an equivalent here. So the idea of what the Court of Justice thinks is fair is very akin to the test of conditional demographic disparity. So the way that we think about this is that this particular test fits very well with non-discrimination law for various reasons that I cannot go into, but one of those is that it's very good at detecting heterogeneous discrimination, minority-based intersectional discrimination. The way that we talk about this in this paper is that we would recommend to publish summary statistics of the test results that you made, as well as the variables that you conditioned on. So what that means is that this type of transparency, making your choices explicit, could actually start a very important public dialogue around what type of disparity is legally and ethically and normatively acceptable. Now, for example, if you're giving out loans and you condition on salaries, you could say either A, yeah, well, can you actually do that even though we have income inequality? Is this a good way of making decisions? Or you could say, yes, there is income inequality, but not using salaries could actually lead to people being given loans that they're not able to repair, and they might indebt them even further. Or C, you could sort of have a conversation around whether or not there are less discriminatory ways to assess creditworthiness that do not discriminate against certain groups. So the advantage of that particular test and the publicly available summary statistics that we suggest is that you open up the doors to a really important public dialogue about what is acceptable in a society and what is not. And we argue if you are open to the dialogue, you show commitment to the duty of substantive equality because it means you're reflecting on those issues. Okay, so let me conclude by coming back to the first slide that I showed you, which is to say, I think we're standing at a crossroad where we can do one of three things. We can either do nothing and let things get worse. We don't have to do anything actively for this. Inequality will just ramp up because this is how the technology works. The second thing is that we can use our efforts to try to fix technology and prevent things from getting worse. Or three, and that's my personal preference, is that we can use technology to shed light on inequalities and then use this as a starting point to erode disparities in the world. From a legal perspective, it's very clear what you should be doing from a legal perspective, what the law wants you to do. It's very clear that the status quo is not neutral and that we need to acknowledge that inequality has become a fact that needs to be disproven rather than be proven. From a European perspective, it's very clear if you said we're just going to keep things as they are, that this is not going to be good enough because the aim of the law is substantive equality. And in the same way that the status quo is not neutral, it's also very important to understand that the choice of fairness metrics is not a neutral act. You have to think about the underlying assumption that you're making when you're choosing a fairness metrics. You have a fairness metrics, one of them that is trying to match error rates, more akin to formal equality, using the status quo as a neutral starting point. You have another one that is more akin to substantive equality, trying to match decision rates. And that allows you to acknowledge that certain groups have had it worse than others. So what you need to understand is that whenever you're choosing a metric, you are making an explicit decision on whether or not the status quo is neutral, and you have to be aware of that. As I said, bias preservation in that paper still has values for in certain areas. I said research and in certain jurisdictions and for certain purposes, it still might be fine. Because it is very complicated and because you have to cross ethics and law and tech, we actually in this paper came up with a checklist that is hopefully helpful to navigate through the jungle that is European non-discrimination law, hopefully helping you to choose the most appropriate fairness metrics. As I said, you can use both. You just need to be aware of what it actually says and be aware of the legal consequences around this. If you are in a European context, in a protected sector, making decisions about people, we would recommend using some form of bias transforming metrics. And as I said in the paper, in this other paper, we recommend that you use conditional demographic disparity because it's the closest that we have when it comes to finding a match between the legal notion of disparity or fairness and a computer science version of that. And the interesting thing is, the very exciting thing is that the paper why fairness cannot be automated and the conditional demographic disparity test was only recently, either December or January this year, implemented by Amazon in their SageMaker Clarify bias toolkit. So the customers of Amazon Web Services are now able to test their algorithms using a various set of tests. And one of them is the one that we're proposing because it is very suitable for European context, which is extremely exciting. So I want to close by just talk a little bit about how I see the world going forward. What I think is that we really need to get on the same page and understand that technology alone cannot fix society. And more data, adding more data to a data pie is not going to be the answer. What we actually would need is have a real commitment to social change. And I think certain bias metrics can actually help us with that. So the bias tests, bias transformation bias test, or CDD in general, I think are a fantastic way to start having this crucial dialogue. If you made the summary statistics open and release the results of your tests and make clear what the variables are that you condition on, for example, income or PhD, we can have starting a dialogue around what type of disparity is acceptable in our society. And I think that's really the next step that we need to take. We need to have a discussion of what kind of society we want to live in, and we must not allow technology to freeze the status quo, because we will never achieve social equality if we settle for the status quo. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing now. Fantastic. Yes, I hope I did go a little bit longer, but I hope that it was interesting. And yes, I'm happy to ask any questions that you might have. Yes, maybe we can start looking at. Maybe Gwen, could you maybe throw us something?
Yeah, shall I read them out to you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we have one question, which has had a lot of votes by Ushnish, so the question is: U.S. law put the burden of proof of AI-based discrimination on the individual being hired, which is unfair as the individual does not know what algorithms are being used. Do European laws put the burden of proof of AI-based discrimination on the organization doing the hiring?
Yes, so I think it's much more like European law is not perfect, but it's definitely easier for individuals to bring cases. So the first is that intent is not necessary. So roughly what we call direct and indirect discrimination in the US would be disparate treatment, and disparate impact. For neither of those in Europe, you actually need intent. So it doesn't matter if you knew about the discrimination or if you had the intent to do it, you will be liable as a tort-based system, regardless if you knew about it. So there's less of burden to prove that. The thing that you need to do as a claimant is actually just to show that something on the face looks discriminatory. So, for example, with the hiring example that I said, saying that there's a height requirement, for example, that was actual case law. And the court said, yes, having that height requirement looks on the face problematic. And as soon as something looks on the face problematic, the burden of proof shifts over to the alleged offender. And they then have two options. They can either say, this is not true. There is no disparity whatsoever. You could say, look at our hiring history. We have 50-50 split. Obviously, this is not a height problem. Or they could say, yes, there is disparity, but it can be justified. And justified would mean that there is a legitimate interest as to why this disparity actually exists. And that would mean that you are making a claim of saying, I need to pursue this legitimate interest in a reasonable and necessary manner. What's here interesting is that as opposed to the US-based system, which is quite similar in terms of justifying disparity, they would call it a business justification as to why disparity exists. In Europe, saying there's a business reason for disparity would be illegal. So you would not get away by saying it is more lucrative or it costs too much money to establish equality. That wouldn't work. So purely economic reasons, to use purely economic reasons trying to justify disparity would not fly in Europe, both for the private and the public sector. So yes, I think the burden of proof is lesser here in Europe. And I think the reasons that you could use to justify disparity are much more narrowed.
Thanks. Shall I just read out another question for you?
Yes. Any.
So, the question by Asia is, do your recommendations also apply in settings that are not about individual demographic protected attributes. I'm thinking, for instance, about producers, businesses in online marketplaces, where groups can be defined by features such as business size, business popularity, market geography, etc.
Yes, so that's a fantastic point. And I don't have a solution, but I understand this is a very big problem because non-discrimination law obviously defines groups in a way that understand a group in need of to be protected because they have suffered historically for some reason. And the new groups that algorithms are creating do not necessarily map onto that concept. So in Europe, there's a whole literature that is called group privacy that is trying to come to grips with that. Brett Middlestead is actually one of the first people that has written about that. Lynette Taylor, for example, is also a good person to look up her work, for example. Lee Bygrave, Alessandro Montellero, those were the first thinkers that realized that this could be a problem, that the way that humans see humans is very different how algorithms see humans. So we are moving in the direction that we're trying to understand that we probably need different types of protection going forward, but there is no solution yet. But if you're interested in the general discussion around that, I would check out those scholars because they have amazing research in that area.
Okay, another question by Ishnut is issues of race are framed as black and white dynamic in the US. In Europe, each country has different ethnic minorities. How is the issue of racial bias codified in law and subsequently implemented in algorithms?
Yes, so that's also a very, very important point. We try to pinpoint that a little bit in the paper, which is to say that just because a certain type of inequality occurs in one sector or in one country doesn't mean it will be the same in a different one. There might be gender biases around the world, but how it's exhibit itself or how it manifests itself might be very different. So the traditions and the historical inequalities in Germany are very different than they are in the UK, and those are very different from the US. Knowing that, what that means is that even more important to say that fairness cannot be automated because really fairness depends on the context that you're actually in. And this is why it's so important that the tech community works with the legal community and actually social scientists that really have the methods to understand what's going on in the world. They understand the social structure, the social story between the data points, and trying to account for that. Because if you only model a system that accounts for inequality in one sector, people in a different one might actually fall through the cracks. So actually you need to have a more nuanced way of thinking about fairness because you can't assume that inequality is the same everywhere.
Great, thank you. Just a message to the attendees, you can rate the questions as well on Slido. So if there is one thing that you want to have answered, please do. Another question from Micah. Is there any legal problem with post-processing methods that try to have a substantively equal result after a model has scored individuals? The case of Ricci versus Di Stefano is often given as an instance where post-decision correction was ruled discriminatory. Yeah. Does this apply to algorithms too?
Right. So that's an interesting point that we also try to address a little bit in the paper, because that particular US case was interesting because the court recognized that there is actually disparate impact, but rectifying it would mean that the group, the white firefighter group, I think it was, would lose out. And there was the question of, can you actually justify rectifying inequality if it means that an advantaged group actually loses out because of that? And as I understand it, I'm not a US lawyer, is that, there is substantive scholarship that thinks this is a problem. You cannot use direct discrimination in order to satisfy indirect discrimination. So you cannot try to achieve the ideas of disparate impact by doing disparate treatment. So that's a US perspective. In Europe, we wouldn't have that problem, actually. We would be much more flexible around that because we have that proportionality test, which means that our legitimate aim would be to, let's say, trying to advance gender equality in pay. And if that means that in resources that are not infinite, it would mean a redistribution, the court would be fine with that. Like the court would say, yes, this is the only way how you can restructure that in the worst case scenario, not that you're supposed to do it, but if it means, and it's the last resort and the only way, the least infringing measure that you have is to redistribute, then you ought to do that. Obviously, the court thinks it's the best idea of trying to make sure that you redistribute in a way that doesn't make others fall through the cracks or being disadvantaged. But because the declared aim is to actually level the playing field at some point, if that means that somebody has to lose out, the court will be fine with that. We also have, for example, a more open view on positive action, for example, that you have hiring strategies that say a certain quota needs to be fulfilled. So the more extreme side of things, but Europe would not have a problem with that if it means cutting up the cake in different ways.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question by Sophia, who's asking, the bias-preserving/transforming discussion reminds me of the disparate treatment impact discussion by Sol and Barocas. Yep. Really interested on the public dialogue about what level of disparity is acceptable. Who should lead this? Regulators like the EHRC?
Yes. So I wrote a paper, I think 2 years ago, which is called Affinity Profiling and Discrimination by Association, where I try to figure out what a legitimate interest actually could look like. And I only quickly teased on that in this talk to say that purely business purposes will probably not fly. From a legal perspective, it's clear that the Court of Justice has the last say on what type of legitimate interest is in accordance with the law. Roughly what the court usually thinks is that a legitimate interest is probably more akin to almost a public interest. So that means things like ensuring that the tax system is coherent, trying to protect minorities, environmental purposes, trying to make sure that the youth is being employed. So things where you can see there's a flavor of communal public interest, those are things where disparity can exist. So for example, if you say a forced retiring age, which could be ageist in the non-discrimination law, that disparity can be justified because you want to employ the youth. So if you're acting in the disinterest of a certain group, you need to show that it's actually in the interest of the majority of people. So that's a very important discussion to have. You can look at what the court actually thinks. That's like the formalistic answer to your question. In general, I actually think that we all ought to have this discussion together. And this is why I think making the criteria explicit and outside facing will be important, because then you and I and the regulator, policymaker, civil society, an industry can have a discussion on whether or not this disparity is actually still okay to have in our society. What I don't want is technologies making those very hard decisions for us. And I feel with bias preservation, this just happens because we just assume, oh, we have done this before and it wasn't too bad. If we just continue this will be not as bad in the future either. So making it public and having the end decision being made by a regulator or by a judge would be my preference. But I think having a public discourse around this first is exactly what we need.
How many more questions can I give you, Sandra? I think we're running out of time a little bit.
Okay, yeah. You can give me one more, and I'm sorry that we have to stop there, but I give you one more, but please feel free to reach out to me by email if you have any follow-up questions, if you want to know more about that topic. I'm very happy to engage with you on that level. But yeah, since we're pressed on time, maybe just one, and I apologize.
Okay, I will take the one that has the most votes by Kartik. Would it be fair to argue that our decision systems are quite hybrid, with AI assuming some roles, but humans occupying key roles? Under such human-in-the-loop scenarios, what are some guidelines for attributing liability or responsibility?
Yes. Okay, that's fantastic. ideally is really that how I see the perfect use of algorithm decision making is not to replace human decision making, but actually try to augment it in a way that gives you something that you as a human don't have. I'm not interested in trying to get the human out of the loop. I want to keep the human there for various reasons that I think are very important, like to assess fairness on a case-to-case basis for a judge is extremely important. What I think the role of the technology is that it can help you to identify your own blind spots that you might not be aware of. So traditionally, when it comes to judges, the way that judges decide if something is unfair or illegally discriminatory is they look at the case and they are able to understand the underlying social inequality, right? So banning headscarves from the workplace, the judge sees it and is like, yes, of course, this is in conflict with freedom of religion, right? Because, you know, you understand how humans work and what tools they use to try to disadvantage certain people. But what if, like, the decision-making process says, I'm not hiring people that like the color green? Maybe it's odd, but it might not be illegal. Maybe it is. We don't know, right? So you as a human and your social gut are not able to assess that. So in addition to your social gut, which is the thing that I really want you to keep, I want to give you an algorithm that will tell you that, did you know if you use green as a decision-making criteria, you filter out gay people? Like, that's, I made this up, right? I made this up, but like there could be a correlation that you are not aware of. And then you start discriminating against certain groups that you were not aware of, and you will be liable for that. Let's be clear. This is why it's so important to test for this, because the courts come after you regardless if you knew about it or not. So what I want you to do, or what judges, regulators to do, is, you know, keep the processes as they are, but just have a little helping tool on their side that warns them in a situation where the social gut might not be as good anymore. Cool. Yes, I think since we are at time, thank you so much for all those amazing questions and for listening to a law talk. After all, it was a pleasure to be here. As I said, my email is open if you wanted to follow up on this or know more about the paper. It's also publicly available. Just feel free to have a look at it. For now, yes, I thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope that we'll find a way to engage together in the future. Thank you.